This is the tale of the longest-serving dictator in the Middle East, from his early days as a young, idealistic revolutionary to his outstanding deeds both domestic and overseas, and how his aspirations for a United States of Africa and a United States of Arabs finally brought him to ruin. Muhammad al-Gaddafi was born in the Libyan desert on June 7, 1942, near Kassar Abu-Hadi, son of a traveling Bedouin farmer. He earned his degree from the University of Libya in 1963. Gaddafi, an ardent Arab patriot and devoted Muslim, started planning to topple King Idris I's kingdom in Libya from an early age. After completing his training at the Libyan Military Academy in 1965, he advanced through the ranks while continuing to plot a coup with the assistance of other army officers. In September 1969, the 28-year-old Muammar Gaddafi and his band of revolutionaries successfully orchestrated a bloodless coup against the highly unpopular monarchical regime of King Idris I, who had ruled the country since independence, but had long been seen by many regular Libyans as deeply corrupt and overly subservient to Western interests. Upon seizing control of the government in a military coup which deposed King Idris I, Gaddafi was then named commander-in-chief of the armed forces and chairman of Libya's new governing body, the Revolutionary Command Council (RCC). His greatest hero was the first pan-Arab revolutionist and Egypt's first president, Gamal Abdul-Nasser. Nasser became a strong proponent of Pan-Arabism, and his bright vision for the future became one in which all Arab countries came together and united to break the Western world order. Deeply inspired by the ideas of Nasser, Gaddafi will join the Libyan Royal Academy of Benghazi, where he was being held for the creation of a revolutionary group known as the Free Unionists Officers Movement, which was modeled after Abdel Nasser Egyptian Free Officers movements. He then went on to be the single most important force in the shaping of his nation's destiny. Embraced by South African President Nelson Mandela for support for various black liberation movements, both within and outside of Africa, but labeled the Mad Dog of the Middle East by American President Ronald Reagan for his defiantly anti-Western foreign policies. Gaddafi's 42-year reign as Libya's leader saw him win the allegiance and duration of many African leaders, while simultaneously becoming a universal figure of hate all around the Western world. To some, a revolutionary and visionary hero; to others, a dictator and promoter of terror. Muhammad Gaddafi was in many ways the perfect embodiment of the old adage, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. As commander-in-chief of the armed forces and chairman of Libya's new governing body, Gaddafi removed the US and British military bases from Libya in 1970. He expelled most members of the native Italian and Jewish communities from Libya that same year, and in 1973 he nationalized all foreign-owned petroleum assets in the country. He outlawed alcoholic beverages and gambling in accordance with his own strict Islamic principles. His regime was allegedly implicated in several horrific terrorist attacks in Europe carried out by Palestinians or other Arab fanatics, and squads of Libyan operatives who were ordered to kill opponents who were emigrants overseas. Through Gaddafi's revolutionary new policies, called for the country's oil wealth to be used to help the poor. He built roads and schools which increased literacy in the lifespan of people. He built housing complexes, apartment complexes, and made it owned by the citizens of Libya. He made it a big deal of telling them those buildings are their homes and their properties. For a while, Libya had a better standard of living than countries like Brazil and Soviet Russia. Everything had been planned by the youthful Colonel Gaddafi to emulate the great Arab leader Gamal Abdul-Nasser, the flamboyant president of Egypt, who had been his childhood hero and whom he saw as an ideological father figure. Starting in 1974, Gaddafi advocated for an Islamic socialist system outlined in the Green Book. This included a kind of populist administration purportedly functioning through people's congresses, labor unions, and other mass groups, along with the nationalization of numerous economic sectors. This was a sort of constitution for the newly liberated nation. He called it the Sharia law. However, Islamic scholars all over the world accused Gaddafi of idol worshipping because they believed that Gaddafi was replacing the Quran with his Green Book. Along these lines, innovations kept coming, such as the 1977 introduction of the Jamahiriya system of administration, a neologism suggesting a popular decentralized confederation. On December 21, 1988, at around 7 p.m. Pan Am flight number 103, a Boeing 747 headed from London to New York City detonated above Lockerbie, Scotland, when a timer-activated bomb exploded. The aircraft was getting ready for the oceanic section of the journey and had risen to a height of around 31,000 feet, 9,500 meters. Constructed using the odorless plastic explosive Semtex, the bomb was concealed behind a cassette player kept inside a suitcase. The blast broke the plane into thousands of pieces that landed in an area covering roughly 850 square miles, 2,200 square kilometers. All 259 passengers and crew members were killed. Falling wreckage destroyed 21 houses and killed an additional 11 people on the ground. Libya's purported involvement in the destruction of a civilian airliner in 1988 over Lockerbie, Scotland, led to United Nations, UN, and US sanctions that further isolated Gaddafi from the international community. In the late 1990s, however, Gaddafi turned over the alleged perpetrators of the bombing to international authorities. UN sanctions against Libya were subsequently lifted in 2003, and following Gaddafi's announcement that Libya would cease its unconventional weapons program, the United States dropped most of its sanctions as well. Although some observers remained critical, these measures provided an opportunity for the rehabilitation of Gaddafi's image abroad and facilitated his country's gradual return to the global community. Meanwhile, Gaddafi was becoming known for his erratic and unpredictable behavior on the international scene. His government financed a broad spectrum of groups worldwide that sought revolutionary objectives of their own, including the Black Panthers and the Nation of Islam in the United States and the Irish Republican Army in Northern Ireland. He became more at odds with the US government as a result of these actions, and a US Air Force stationed in Britain launched a forceful attack on Gaddafi's Bab al-Azizia residence in Tripoli on April 30, 1986, killing Gaddafi's youngest son, Saif al-Arab, and wounding 3 of his granddaughters. Gaddafi, who was allegedly inside the house that was the target of the attack, managed to flee unharmed. NATO refuted claims that it had adopted a strategy aimed at killing Gaddafi in the wake of the airstrike. In February 2009, Gaddafi was elected chairman of the African Union AU, and later that year he gave his first speech before the UN General Assembly. The lengthy critical speech, in which he threw a copy of the UN Charter, generated a significant measure of controversy within the international community. The Libyan Revolt of 2011. In early 2010, Gaddafi's attempt to remain as chairman of the AU beyond the customary one-year term was met with resistance from several other African countries and ultimately was denied. Anti-Gaddafi protests started in the Libyan city of Benghazi in February 2011, following the removal of Presidents Zine al-Abidine Ben Ali and Hosni Mubarak from office in neighboring Tunisia and Egypt by anti-government protests. The Gaddafi administration ordered artillery attacks against demonstration sites and ordered police and mercenary forces to fire live gunfire at demonstrators as the protests spread around the nation in an attempt to forcibly put an end to them. Senior officials in the Libyan government were enraged by Gaddafi's vision of a united Africa, which resulted in several acts of violence and protests. Numerous prominent Libyan ambassadors either resigned or expressed support for the rebellion, while the Minister of Justice of Libya resigned in protest. But we are in 2024 now, and we know by far all these leaders who resigned and were in support of the rebellion were influenced by Western powers, especially NATO. On February 22, 2011, Gaddafi delivered a rambling, defiant speech, refusing to step down and calling the demonstrators traitors and saboteurs.
هذول اللي وراهم اللي يقوموا بالعمل هذا يعطينهم حبوب وراهم مش بإرادتهم. إذا لم يتحقق كل هذا أنا بعد ذلك سنعلن الزحف. سنعلن الزحف المقدس.
He claimed that the opposition had been directed by Al-Qaeda and that the protesters had been under the influence of hallucinogenic drugs. He urged his supporters to defend him by fighting protesters. The opposition, however, managed to gain strength in more territories, and international pressure for Gaddafi to step down increased. On February 26, 2011, the UN Security Council unanimously approved a measure that included sanctions against the Gaddafi regime, imposing a travel ban and an arms embargo and freezing the Gaddafi family's assets. On February 28 in that year, the United States announced that it had frozen $30 billion in Libyan assets linked to Gaddafi. His hold on power appeared increasingly weak as the opposition forces gained strength. By the end of February, opposition forces had established control over large amounts of Libyan territory, encircling Tripoli, where Gaddafi remained in control but in growing isolation. In interviews with Western media, Gaddafi insisted that he was still well loved by the Libyan people and denied that the regime had used violence against the demonstrators. He repeated his claim that the opposition in Libya had been organized by al-Qaeda. With the recapture of numerous territories that the rebels had won early in the fight, Gaddafi's forces appeared to have the upper hand in Libya. On March 17th, the UN Security Council decided to approve military intervention to defend civilians as Gaddafi's forces moved closer to Benghazi. The subsequent air assault, spearheaded by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization NATO, caused considerable harm to forces loyal to Gaddafi. Two prominent Libyan officials, Musa Kusa and Ali Abdussalam el-Treki, who were both part of Gaddafi's inner circle, defected in late March, rocking the Gaddafi dictatorship. In spite of the losses, Gaddafi seemed to be solidly in charge in Tripoli and had openly declared that he would oppose any effort to overthrow him. Despite the NATO air campaign, soldiers loyal to Gaddafi persisted in their activities. The International Criminal Court (ICC) declared at the beginning of March that it will begin looking into potential crimes against humanity committed by Gaddafi and his allies. On May 16th, the ICC called for arrest warrants to be issued against Gaddafi, along with his son Saif al-Islam and the Libyan intelligence chief, Abdullah Senussi, for ordering attacks on civilians during the uprising. In August 2011, Gaddafi's hold on power appeared to break when rebel forces entered Tripoli and took control of most areas of the city. Rebel fighters achieved a major symbolic victory on August 23rd when they captured the Bab al-Azizia compound, Gaddafi's headquarters in Tripoli. Jubilant crowds ransacked the compound, destroying symbols of the Gaddafi regime. Gaddafi's whereabouts remained uncertain, although he released several audio messages urging the Libyan people to resist the rebels. As rebel forces solidified their hold on Tripoli, they intensified their efforts to track down Gaddafi, offering a $1.7 million reward for killing or capturing him. Gaddafi headed to Sirte because it's where he hailed from, and he believed that he could be protected by the clan and tribal loyalties. As the rebels closed in on their main target with their French jets flying overhead, suddenly the colonel's convoy got hit by a NATO airstrike, forcing the once almighty colonel to take refuge in a sewage pipe accompanied by a good number of bodyguards. When the National Transitional Council fighters came, they opened fire, which saw the demise of Gaddafi's bodyguards and wounded Gaddafi himself in the leg and shoulders. After injuring and capturing Gaddafi and taking his last stronghold, Sirte, the rebel forces took control and paraded the city with Gaddafi. If you are just joining us, then you are watching the factual reason why Gaddafi was killed. Like the video and share it so it reaches many more Africans. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell in order not to miss any of our amazing contents. Looking at the number of reasons why Muammar Gaddafi was killed, you might begin to wonder if this was because of excess dictatorship. And if it was, then you might also wonder the type of leadership such a dictator had before his death. Here is the real reason why he was killed. As earlier mentioned, Gaddafi was killed after being accused of several actions and attempts, most especially his desire to put forth a United States of Africa backed with a physical gold currency known as the gold dinar. According to credible and reliable sources, he was not killed for humanitarian purposes, but for power, oil and money. The United States, Asia, and Europe would have been compelled to purchase minerals and oil in the African currency backed by gold if Gaddafi had been successful in establishing such a monetary system in Africa, which would have increased sales through the African Union. Gaddafi vigorously promoted this goal, particularly when serving as chairman in 2009. The Western powers strongly objected to the plan, arguing that it would weaken their currencies and badly impact their economies, giving them less or no influence over African nations. NATO's plan to kill Gaddafi is the same as that of Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was assassinated by the US because he chose to sell his country's oil in the euro currency at the expense of the United States dollars. According to the International Monetary Fund's report, Libya's central bank in 2011 possessed an estimated amount of 144 tons of gold in its vaults. Muammar Gaddafi's plan was to introduce a physical gold-backed currency, which he previewed that all African and Muslim nations will adopt. Though he had this in mind, he believed that the United States may have learned about the gold dinar due to some kind of rivalry with the euro dollar. A senior advisor to US President Sidney Blumenthal sent an email to Secretary General Hillary Clinton informing her that as of late March 2011, Gaddafi's government was holding 143 tons of gold and comparable amounts of silver in their bank. Hillary Clinton, the then United States Secretary of State, after hearing this sought to prevent creation of such occurrences in Africa.
That is the land of unconfirmed. Yes, we came, we saw, he died.
This physical currency would have allowed Africa to shake off the last heavy chains of colonial exploitation in the continent. These stocks were moved to the southwest of Libya's border with Niger. The situation was further complicated when former French President Nicolas Sarkozy, who was also interested in Libya, learned of the country's gold and silver holdings. Sarkozy then launched an attack on Libya, with part of his plans being to seize some of this precious metal and Libyan oil production to strengthen French influence in this nation and North Africa, to ameliorate his domestic political circumstances in France, and to counter Gaddafi's schemes to liberate the so-called Francophone Africa from the entangling French grip. Let's talk more about the gold dinar. This new currency was a revolutionary dream for Africa, with the goal of shifting oil revenues from American banks to state-controlled funds. In other words, it was intended to eliminate the use of the dollar for oil transactions in African nations, particularly Nigeria, Tunisia, Egypt, and Angola. These nations were prepared to switch to the gold dinar as soon as it was introduced, but sadly, in March 2011, NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization coalition forces, launched a military campaign in Libya under the pretext of freedom and humanitarian concerns. Unfortunately, many uninformed Libyans chose to believe the Western media rather than support their leader, Gaddafi, who was able to secure the support of numerous Libyan tribes by offering them cheap and accessible education, free healthcare, almost free gasoline, and free water. As a result, Gaddafi was able to rule Libya for over 42 years. The African dream came to an end with Gaddafi's passing. This was going to be a nightmare for Western banking, which greatly benefits the USA and most European countries. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization's forces NATO were involved in Gaddafi's capture, while the Libyan military were also on the ground to enhance defense. Several videos related to his death were shown on television and circulated on the internet. The leader was killed alongside his son Muammar Gaddafi, and they were buried a few days after their assassination. Some of the things that Gaddafi accomplished for the people angered his opponents. For example, in Libya, power was provided without charge. Under Gaddafi's rule, all residents had free access to power, fuel, healthcare, and education, all of which most Libyans could afford thanks to his wise use of oil profits. Libya was set to surpass France as the most powerful nation in Africa thanks to its abundant resources and personal incentives. For example, loans from state-owned financial enterprises and banks in Libya were legally granted at 0% interest. Living in a house was a must-have issue for all Libyans. Gaddafi even found that his parents would not get a house until everyone in Libya had one. In fact, having a house in Libya was considered a human right for all. Newly wedded couples in Libya received money from the government to build their new apartments. Necessities were given out freely, or at very affordable prices to Libyans to better their lives amongst others. All these were seen as provocative and dictatorial to those who were not in support of. All of the other reasons for Gaddafi's death stem from the Muslim Times media source. Among his many accomplishments was the construction of the world's largest irrigation project, known as the Great Man-Made River, which used enormous pipes to transport fresh water from the fossil Nubian sandstone aquifer system across Libya. The Libyan government provided all of the funding for this project. Neither the IMF nor China provided loans. Sadly, NATO forces destroyed this irrigation system on purpose and under strict orders, and they even destroyed the factory where the project's pipes were manufactured. Gaddafi and Obama were best friends, but since Obama was now on the West side, making the matters worse as the president of the USA, the West broke their friendship. That hard currency would have allowed Africa to shake off the last heavy chains of colonial exploitation.
Today, the government of Libya announced the death of Muammar Gaddafi. This marks the end of a long and painful chapter for the people of Libya.
Although Muammar Gaddafi had his own personal shortcomings, what is widely known about him by people in Libya and Africa was that he was at the verge of getting Africa out of external control. Gaddafi dominated Libyan politics for 4 decades and was a subject of a pervasive cult of personalities. He was decorated with several awards and praised for his anti-imperialist stance, support for Arab and then African unity, as well as significant for the development of Libya. He transformed Libya into a new socialist state in 1977. He officially adopted a symbolic role in governance but remained head of both the military and the revolutionary committees responsible for policing and suppressing dissent. We have seen the assassinations of many African leaders who had the mission of freeing their people from Western influence or uniting Africa. Look at the likes of Patrice Lumumba of Congo, Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa of Manchuria, and Thomas Sankara, amongst others. If this video was an interesting one to you, then please give it a like. What impact do you think the death of Gaddafi has imposed on Africa? Do you think that Libyans made a very big mistake to stand against Gaddafi when he needed them the most? Thanks for watching and see you in our next video.